As colonial America became increasingly resistant towards England's authority on the colonies, one man's voice was heard above the uproar.
Until the glorious object of our struggle be obtained, then we must fight. I repeat it, sir. We must fight!
Learn why leading Virginians met at St. John's Church in Richmond, Virginia, and discover what led Patrick Henry to appeal for liberty or death.
Funding for Liberty or Death was generously provided by the St. John's Church Foundation, whose mission is to preserve and promote St. John's Church, a National Historic Landmark, as an educational resource to students, scholars, and visitors, and as an important site in Virginia's heritage tourism industry. Patrick Henry Center for Individual Liberty, modeled after the life and philosophy of Patrick Henry.
Well, the Liberty or Death speech is, I suppose, at the heart now of the legend of Patrick Henry. Those who were there, who witnessed it, said that they could never forget that moment. Patrick Henry had something of the preacher in him, and I think that was the secret of his success. He could combine the political orator and the admirable ways of a gentleman with the stern style of the preacher and sounding the kind of moral thunder that preachers were expected to sound.
And his statements against king and country at that time period certainly were viewed as treasonous, but today we would see them as the heart, if you will, of what the revolution was about.
He was really channeling the moment when he spoke, and he just dazzled people. They were just awed by his ability to encapsulate powerful ideas in an extremely accessible and forceful manner.
It was the voice and the delivery that took a good speech and made it into an epic history-changing event. It is one of the speeches that stands out above almost all others in American history. Probably only the Gettysburg Address is as well known as the Liberty or Death speech.
In March 1775, Virginia's leaders were gathering outside of the law to take care of the colony's affairs. They would travel from all parts of Virginia. At stake was their perceived right to self-government, a belief shaped since the earliest days of the colony.
It has been said that the independent spirit of America was born out of the British policy of benign neglect towards the colonist. The shores and settlements of America were at least a 3-week journey by ship from England. This made it difficult for the crown to rule his subjects in the New World. The kings of England had more pressing matters to attend to, such as 3 civil wars and the challenges of royal succession. This is why, in 1619, the king allowed the colony of Virginia to set up its own government, a general assembly to make laws for society. In many respects, the colonists, the landowners, planters, businessmen, attorneys at law, gentry, were free to manage their own lives for well over a century. They grew accustomed to self-government and wanted it to remain that way.
During this long period of time, the colonists came to appreciate the value of that independence from Parliament. They did not think of it as independence from Parliament. What they perceived it to be was their own exercising of their own English rights in their colony. In Virginia, it was the House of Burgesses. For 150 years, the colonists in North America had been taxing themselves to build a Capitol building and to build courthouses and to build churches and to build roads, to support militia companies to defend the colony from the Indians or from the French or from the Spanish or whatever other enemy there was. The English government largely neglected the colonies, and it had a wholesome, benign effect on the colonists.
And during that time period, the colonies developed many of the institutions and the ideas which would later shape the Revolution. Those included things like economic relationships, political systems, and ideas about their rights and liberties, which ultimately drove what they would do in the Revolutionary period.
The colonists could elect their own delegates to the lower assemblies, like the Virginia House of Burgesses, and they could form laws. But the king's approval was required for every law they passed, and they could meet and craft legislation only when the royal governor, the king's representative in the colony, asked them to meet.
One court case illustrated the struggle between royal power and the General Assemblies. It was also the first time the public took notice of Patrick Henry. The Virginia General Assembly collected taxes to pay the annual salaries of Anglican ministers who were paid in tobacco. In 1758, the crop failed and tobacco was worth 3 times more than normal. Virginia's economy struggled, but the ministers stood to make a windfall profit. In response, the General Assembly passed the Two-Penny Act, a law intended to level the playing field by paying the ministers the original lower amount. The ministers appealed to the king, who struck down the law. One parson in Hanover County, Virginia, sued in court for the full amount that was due to him. The judge upheld the king's decision and awarded damages to the parson, but it was up to the jury to decide how much he would receive. Patrick Henry, then a young lawyer, stood up and argued that only the General Assembly had the right to make laws in the colonies. He accused the ministers of being greedy during tough times, and then Henry took aim at the king.
A king, by disallowing acts of this salutary nature from being the father of his people, has degenerated into a tyrant and forfeits all rights to his subjects' obedience.
Everyone in the room was shocked, but Henry had convinced the jury. They awarded the minister a total of only 1 penny. Henry had successfully thwarted the will of the king and was among the first in America to directly challenge royal authority in the colonies.
So there was pressure to go from benign neglect to more direct management. But what is probably more important in the sort of bringing things to a flashpoint was the French and Indian War, the great struggle in which the British Empire and the French Empire fought it out.
Well, the so-called French and Indian War, it's also called the 7 Years' War, began in North America in 1754 when a young and ambitious officer named George Washington was sent by the governor of Virginia to go into the Ohio Valley and oust a French fort at the forks of the Ohio, what's now Pittsburgh. And then he failed to do that, but he did ambush a French patrol which started this war. Well, now the British policy is to conquer Canada once and for all by investing unprecedented numbers of soldiers and warships and cannon and other munitions.
March on.
So this turns out to be the most expensive war the British had ever waged. This meant at the end of the war, they had this enormous debt that they had to fund, and they also had a larger empire to administer. So the British are going to keep a permanent army of about 10,000 men in North America, whereas before the French and Indian War, they'd had virtually no men in North America. This is expensive, and so they need money for it. And the notion is they could get some of the money by taxing the colonists, as they had never done before.
For the next 10 years, Parliament would impose various taxes on the colonies. The Sugar Act, a tax on imported sugar from the West Indies, was among the first.
And the colonists did not see this as a threat to their individual rights and liberties because this was not a tax directly imposed on them. It was a tax, it was more of a way to regulate the commerce.
Where they did not see appropriateness was in taxes that were purely for revenue. The Stamp Act had nothing to do with the regulation of trade. It was on products that the colonists used each and every day. A lease, a marriage license, playing cards, and newspapers. So this was the kind of tax that everyone could feel. And this was a tax that was affixed upon the object with a stamp, thus the term the Stamp Act, and it began to serve as sort of a reminder of oppression more than anything else.
So the issue wasn't that very heavy taxes were being put on the colonists. On the contrary, they were very small. But the colonists saw that as insidious, They saw that if they accepted the precedent that they would pay these small taxes, they feared that down the road the British would increase those taxes and that someday this would turn out to be a very heavy tax burden and one that would impoverish them.
They would have to deal with it, or, as many chose, play ostrich. And there must have been some speculation, I think, that Patrick Henry was not going to play ostrich.
Patrick Henry came into the 1765 House of Burgesses at the time of the Stamp Act as a young, untested, but already well-known orator. Patrick Henry took the argument about the Stamp Act to a new level of intensity. Patrick Henry proposed resolutions complaining of the Stamp Act, that it was taxation without representation, that it was unprecedented, that it flew in the rights of the colonial legislatures. But he went a step further.
Resolve, the General Assembly of the colony have the only exclusive right and power to levy taxes and impositions on the inhabitants of this colony. Any attempt to vest such power in a person or persons other than the General Assembly has a manifest tendency to destroy British as well as American freedom.
Of the 5 resolutions Henry introduced, his 5th was most controversial, and the debate that followed was so intense that murmurs of treason surfaced. Henry responded swiftly.
Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III may profit by their example.
Henry's 6th and 7th resolutions were never introduced. They were even more controversial than the 5th. The 7th stated that the colonies were bound only to the laws of the General Assembly and not the king. It also said that those who supported taxes imposed by anyone other than the Assembly was an enemy of the colony.
In other words, it was, in a sense, an incitement to riot. It called on it gave legitimacy to outright resistance, defiance of the act. And no one in all America had imagined going that far.
The opposition to the act in the colonies took several forms. Informal groups in most of the colonies urged a boycott of English manufactured goods. Merchants, planters, farmers, men, women, old, young, all took part in refusing to do business under the Stamp Act, hoping to put pressure on English merchants and English manufacturers to put pressure on the House of Commons to repeal the act.
Of course, it's also women who will make sure that the family doesn't buy British goods. They won't drink tea anymore. The most quintessential icon of Englishness, but it's women who have to find something else for their families to drink. The #1 item that colonists were importing from England was cloth. So it's women who say, rather than buying English-made cloth, we will go home, we will raise animals, we will shear off the wool and card the wool and clean the wool and twist it and spin it and weave it into cloth and then sew it into clothing. It wasn't until the American Revolution that we get this age of homespun. Men pass non-importation agreements, it's women who make them stick.
Also, there were armed crowds that were armed with sticks and rocks that were doing their best to harass tax collectors and to oblige them to resign on peril of having their houses trashed or their bodies roughed up.
The economic pressure they brought on the British Parliament succeeded. They failed to notice one thing, however. When Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, Parliament passed the Declaratory Act. The Declaratory Act stated very clearly that Parliament had the right and the constitutional power to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. That was a bolder declaration of parliamentary rights in the colonies even than the enactment of the Stamp Act.
England will follow very quickly, however, in 1767 with a new series of acts known as the Townshend duties. And these were even a wider sweeping set of taxes on a variety of goods. And the colonists had a very, very negative reaction to the Townshend duties and led to further protests. Probably the most notable event that came from this is an event we know as the Boston Massacre. It led to a further log on the fire of revolution because most interpreted this as English oppression at its worst, firing into an unarmed mob. The colonists did learn that resistance did work to some degree, and when England repealed the Townshend duties, all were repealed except the tax on tea. The tax on tea actually lowered the price that colonists were going to pay for tea. Nevertheless, the fact that a tax continued caused a great deal of concern for a product that was widely consumed in the colonies. And so protests occurred over the tea tax that ranged again from drinking alternatives to tea to eventually dumping tea. As we know, the Tea Party occurred in Boston Harbor, but often forgotten is there were tea parties all up and down the East Coast.
But what happened next is that the British responded in such a heavy-handed manner to the Boston Tea Party. They imposed these coercive acts, which punished the Port of Boston by shutting it down until the Bostonians paid for the tea that was destroyed. And they also altered the charter of government for Massachusetts, consolidating much more power in the hands of the royal governor of Massachusetts. That Virginians then almost unanimously said, if the British can just arbitrarily cut off a seaport's commerce and can arbitrarily change a colonial government, no colony is safe.
All the colonies recognized that this was a common cause, that for all the differences they had with the Massachusetts folk and all their doubts about whether one should be so rash as to throw tea in the harbor, they knew we can't submit to this.
The Virginia House of Burgesses called for a day of prayer to be in solidarity with the people of Boston. The royal governor, Lord Dunmore, reacted by dissolving the assembly. To convene would be unauthorized, but the delegates met anyway in the capital city of Williamsburg. This was the first Virginia convention, but the governor and his troops were too close and could easily disperse the delegates. The second Virginia convention would have to be further away, out of reach of the governor and his army.
The delegates converged on the small town of Richmond. The convention decided to meet at St. John's Church, then called Henrico Parish Church. It was the only building in town big enough to hold all of the delegates. Also, the church's pastor, the Reverend Miles Selden, was sympathetic to the colonial cause.
By dissolving the House of Burgesses, Lord Dunmore had left Virginia with no functioning government. Several laws lapsed. Of major concern was no one had the authority to arm or train a militia, or to provide for its governance in case it was called up in defense of the country, especially against the Indians on the western frontier. And we still had an eye on Boston. The delegates believed that if the Boston Harbor could be shut down, it could happen anywhere, even in Virginia. The distrust between the governor and the assembly ran high. Dunmore suspected the colonists would form a militia. The colonists suspected Dunmore would use royal gunships to blockade the Chesapeake Bay. The economy and the lives of the colonists would be ruined.
There was the threat of the Crown sending over Marines and Navy ships and soldiers to reduce the colonists to a proper sense of obedience. And there were rumors of slave uprisings in Virginia repeatedly in 1774.
The gentry were constantly worried about slave revolts because they also knew that in Barbados, Jamaica, there were constant slave revolts, and they heard on other plantations of slaves rising up, rebelling against their masters. And so with the use of patrols that went through the slave community on a regular basis, those things were part of a system to keep people in their place.
Slave revolts, Indian wars, and British subjugation galvanized the need for a militia, and arming a militia had broader implications.
Would they set up their own militia under the authority of the provincial Congress rather than under the authority of the royal governor? Now, to do so was an extremely radical act. It's a key step toward independence. And that's the context of the famous "Give me liberty or give me death" speech.
Most of Virginia's leaders were there. Peyton Randolph was chosen president of the convention, as he'd been chosen president of the First Continental Congress before. There were men like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Richard Henry Lee, Edmund Pendleton, and Patrick Henry.
And I, John Townswell, was clerk of the convention. There are no surviving contemporary records of the debates. The events you will see were based on eyewitness accounts. First, we'll consider a petition from the people of the island of Jamaica.
Is all in order, gentlemen?
Aye, sir.
Are you ready, Mr. Tazewell?
I am, sir.
I hereby declare this convention to be open. The Reverend Miles Selden will now lead prayers.
Let us pray. O Lord, our heavenly Father, high and mighty ruler, who dost from thy throne behold all the dwellers upon the earth, most heartily we beseech thee with thy favor to behold our most gracious sovereign, Lord King George, and to replenish him with the grace of thy Holy Spirit, that he may always incline to thy will and walk in thy way, through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Amen. Clerk will now read minutes of yesterday.
The delegates met according to adjournment. Pursuant to order, the convention resumed the consideration of the proceedings of last year's Continental Congress and passed the following resolution. Resolved unanimously that this convention cordially approves of the resolutions of the American Continental Congress and consider this whole continent as under the highest obligations to that very respectable body for the wisdom of their counsels. Adjourned until today at 10 o'clock.
Mr. President.
Mr. Thomas Jefferson, gentleman from Albemarle County.
I move that the minutes as read by the clerk be approved and adopted.
I second, Mr. President.
The minutes have been moved and seconded. All those in favor will say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The minutes are adopted. Let the proceedings for this day now begin. Gentlemen, I have here in my hand a copy of the recent petition and memorial of the Assembly of Jamaica to the King's Most Excellent Majesty, as it pertains to the colonies, and Virginia in particular, and as sufficient time has passed for your examination of it, the Chair feels it fitting that some appropriate recognition of it be given by this convention.
Mr. President.
Mr. Edmund Pendleton, the gentleman from Caroline County.
I have a resolution to present, sir.
You may proceed, sir.
Resolved, that the unfeigned thanks and most grateful acknowledgments of this convention be presented to the very respectable Assembly of the Island of Jamaica for their exceedingly generous and affectionate part they have so nobly taken in the unhappy contest between Great Britain and her colonies, and for their truly patriotic endeavors to fix the just claims of the colonists upon the most permanent constitutional principles. That the Assembly be assured that it is the most ardent wish of this colony, and we are persuaded of the whole continent of North America, to see a speedy return to those halcyon days when we lived a free and a happy people.
Mr. President.
Mr. Robert Carter Nicholas, gentleman from James City County.
Mr. President, I rise to second the resolution read by the gentleman from Caroline.
Hear, hear. Hear, hear.
We must stand firm for our country.
Aye.
But what days were happier than those of the near past?
Mr. President.
Virginia, under the best of kings, enjoyed a generous prosperity. I speak as treasurer of the colony, and I take a natural...
Sir, the question on the floor is the adoption of the resolutions read by the gentleman from Caroline County. You have seconded them, have you not?
Aye.
Very well. All those in favor of adopting these resolutions will say aye.
Aye.
Are there any opposed? The resolutions are adopted. The clerk will transmit a copy of these resolutions to the Speaker of the Jamaican Assembly by the earliest opportunity. The floor is now open for new business.
Mr. President.
Mr. Patrick Henry, the gentleman from Hanover County.
I could but unite in that truly patriotic address of the legislature of Jamaica. That address was noble and well-intentioned. But to my mind, I think it is absurd to rest quietly, expecting a return of those halcyon days of old.
Here, here.
I beg to offer the following resolution.
You may proceed, sir.
Resolved that a well-regulated militia, composed of gentlemen and yeomen, is the natural strength and only security of a free government. That such a militia in this colony would render it unnecessary for the mother country to keep among us any standing army of mercenary forces, and would obviate the pretext of taxing us for their support. That the establishment of such a militia is at this time absolutely necessary for the protection and defense of the country, and the known remissness of the government in calling us together in legislative capacity renders it too insecure in this time of danger and distress to assume that any provisions will be made to secure our inestimable rights and liberties from those further violations from which they are threatened.
But this means war, Mr. Henry!
Resolved, therefore, that this colony be put to immediate state of defense. That a committee be named by this convention to prepare a plan for embodying, arming, and disciplining such a number of men as may be sufficient for that purpose.
Mr. President.
Mr. Richard Henry Lee, gentleman from Westmoreland County.
Sir, I rise to second the resolutions of the gentleman from Hanover. I think they are timely and highly important.
Thank you for the second, Mr. Lee.
Don't be rash, sir. This is nothing short of a declaration of war.
It is Mr. Henry who is rash. At this moment, the mother country is highly sympathetic towards us.
Sympathetic when British ships blockade our harbors.
We must do nothing disloyal to the king.
Gentlemen, Mr. Lee has the floor.
Sir, I yield to no man in proper loyalty to the king. But a king that fails to protect his subjects has broken the sacred covenant with his people. Gentlemen, I will not agree to the sacrifice of a single one of our rights and privileges to any power on earth.
Aye.
We use but a natural right in making provision for our protection. We mean no aggression, no violence, no treason. But if the ministerial powers in England choose to regard our actions as such, then I say to them, follow the responsibility of the course taken by them.
Of course, you suggest we'll be war.
I hate to contemplate the thought of collision with the mother country. And I know our weaknesses. But gentlemen, has not nature come to our aid by spreading 3,000 miles of water between us and them? If we have our weaknesses, so does England. She will be at a vast disadvantage to transport over such distances in the event of war her armies and supplies.
Aye.
Sir, I will admit the probable calculations may still be against us. But I will say with our immortal bard, thrice be he armed who hath his quarrel just, and he but naked, though locked up in steel, whose conscience with injustice is corrupted.
Well said, sir. Well said.
Mr. President.
Benjamin Harrison, the gentleman from Charles City County.
I desire to raise my voice in opposition to the adoption of the resolutions at this time. I find them to be rash and inexpedient. The report from England, as we all know, is that our petition to the king passed from the last convention has been graciously received. No sufficient time has passed for a reply to come to us.
Sir, you know well Mr. Lee has received reliable word that the king will reject our request.
I know no such thing.
It's coming, sir. It's coming.
Have order. Mr. Harrison.
Gentlemen, I am as warm a friend of liberty as any man in this convention, and is little disposed to submit. But national civility and filial respect demands that we do nothing hastily. We offered no provocations. I'm a farmer, and I represent the farmers of Charles City County, and I deprecate any step that might be taken that would stop the production of corn and tobacco and force the people of Virginia into starvation.
Oh, starvation indeed, sir. And what of the brave people of Boston?
I represent Charles City County, not Boston.
Mr. President!
But if it can happen in New England, it can happen here. The colony needs to be prepared.
Mr. Thomas Jefferson from Albemarle County.
Sir, Virginia is bound by honor and interest to share one fate with our sister colonies. I recognize no allegiance to Parliament, only to the king. The colonies are tied to England by the tie of the crown. Virginia is a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. Aye. Gentlemen, Virginia should be prepared. I regard these acts of Parliament, limiting our westward growth, attempting to tax our people without our consent, closing the port of Boston, and all of the intolerable acts, sir, are the aggressive acts of a foreign power. They should be resisted, gentlemen, with all the means in our power.
Not to go to war.
The God who gave us life gave us liberty at the same time. I call earnestly on this convention to support Mr. Henry's resolution.
Oh, Mr. Jefferson, we must act with discretion, which is guided by simple reason.
How can one be discreet, sir, when British ships and cannon are aimed at short range at the port of Boston?
Boston! That's 400 miles away!
Ships could soon be in the Chesapeake.
Mr. Harrison, Mr. Henry. Take your seats, gentlemen. Take your seat, Mr. Henry. Mr. Edmund Pendleton, gentleman from Caroline.
I hope that this convention will proceed slowly before rushing Virginia into war. Is this a moment to disgust our friends in England who are laboring for the repeal of the unjust taxes which afflict us? To turn their friendship into hatred and their pity into revenge? Are we ready for war?
Are we ready for tyranny?
Aye, sir.
Where are our arms? Where are soldiers? Where are monies, the very sinews of war? They are nowhere to be found. Insufficient force or abundance so as to give us any reasonable hope of a successful resistance. We are, in truth, poor and defenseless. And we should strike only when it becomes absolutely necessary and not before. And yet, the gentlemen in favor of this resolution talk of assuming the front of war. Of assuming it, too, against a nation, one of the most powerful in all of the world. A nation armed and ready on all points, whose navy rides in triumph on every sea, whose army never marches but to certain victory. For God's sake, Mr. President, let us allow all reasonable delay, and then, if the worst shall come to the worst, we shall have no feelings of blame.
This is not a time for timid measures, Mr. Pendleton.
Aye, sir.
There is no man at this convention more attached to the liberties of this country than the man who is now addressing you. Aye. But we must think, gentlemen, before we sacrifice perhaps everything to a spirit of indignation and revenge. Think of the strength and the luster that we derive from our connection with Great Britain. Think of the domestic comforts which we have drawn from that same source, of the ties of trade and of business, of our friends and families still living in England. The tyrannies from which we suffer, after all, are the tyrannies of a party in temporary possession of power. Give a little time. Take no hostile action, and these tyrants in England will be overthrown. Men in sympathy with America will assume authority.
The gentleman is mistaken.
Our ills will pass away, and the sunshine of the halcyon days
Halcyon days,
He's a dreamer.
We must arm, you say.
Aye, sir.
But, gentlemen, remember that blows are apt to follow the arming, and blood will follow the blows, and when this occurs, the dogs of war will be loosed. Friends will be converted into enemies, and this flourishing country will be swept by a tornado of death and destruction.
Mr. President.
Mr. Robert Carter Nicholas, the gentleman from James City County.
Mr. President. I heartily agree with the gentleman from Caroline. I consider the resolutions of the gentleman from Hanover to be hasty, rash, and unreasonable.
Sir.
The motion pushes too far. We must strive to have errors rectified, not to alter or destroy our ties with the mother country. But more than that, I deem the militia upon which the gentleman depends to be wholly insufficient for our defense. It will prove the bane of the war, which the gentleman from Hanover seems so willing to hurry us into. Sir, I hope these alarming military resolutions will be voted down. But if the colony must be armed, then let her raise a force of 10,000 men.
Let the man speak, gentlemen.
Aye, 10,000 men, I say, to be trained as regulars and serve for the duration of the war. Short-term enlistments of militia, such as the gentleman from Hanover contemplates, will prove the bane of the war. But I speak for peace, not war, until war is forced upon us.
War is being forced upon us, sir. The British have sent a hostile navy and army to subdue Boston.
That is New England, Colonel, not Virginia.
But it didn't happen here, sir.
Gentlemen, Mr. Thomas Nelson, the gentleman from York County.
Gentlemen, I'm a merchant in Yorktown, and I derive much profit from my trade with England. But why should we labor to raise our fortunes if they may be taken from us at the leisure of others? Yeah. Tyranny and naked aggression must be met with preparation and fortitude. Let me say this, sir, and I call God to witness. If any British troops land in the county of York where I am lieutenant, I will await no orders. I will summon the militia and drive the invaders to the water's edge! To arms! To arms! To arms! To arms!
Mr. President, gentlemen, the taking up of arms should always be a last resort. But can any honorable man scruple or hesitate to take up arms in defense of so priceless a thing as liberty?
Hear, hear!
Is it not clear, as the sun at its noontide brightness, that some provision must be made to ensure proper arms and ammunition for the public good?
Aye, sir.
And as the training of our militia has been much neglected, I will willingly resume my post of command should necessity arise.
Hear, hear, Colonel, hear, hear!
Gentlemen, the sword of our defense must be forged on the anvil of necessity. For my own part, it is my full intention to offer up both my life and my fortune in the cause that we are engaged in if need be.
Aye.
I urge that these resolutions, now under discussion, be adopted.
Mr. President, Mr. President.
Mr. Patrick Henry, the gentleman from Hanover County.
No man thinks more highly than I do of the patriotism as well as the abilities of the very worthy gentlemen who've just addressed the House. But different men often see the same subject in different lights.
Aye.
And therefore I hope it will not be thought disrespectful to these gentlemen if, entertaining as I do opinions of a character very opposite to theirs, I shall set forth my sentiments freely and without reserve. This is no time for ceremony. The question before the House is one of awful moment to our country. For my own part, I consider it nothing less than a question of freedom or slavery. And in proportion to the magnitude of the subject ought to be the freedom of the debate. It is only in this way that we can hope to arrive at the truth and fulfill the great responsibility that we owe to God and our country. Should I keep back my opinions at such a time through fear of giving offense, then I should consider myself guilty of treason toward my country in an act of disloyalty to the majesty of heaven, which I revere above all earthly kings.
Amen, sir.
Mr. President, it is natural for man to indulge in the illusions of hope. We are apt to shut our eyes against the painful truth and listen to the song of the siren until she transforms us into beasts. Is this the part of wise men engaged in a great and arduous struggle for liberty? Are we disposed to be of the number of those who, having eyes, see not, and having ears, hear not, those things which so nearly concern our temporal salvation. For my own part, however great the anguish of the spirit it might cost, I am willing to know the whole truth, to know the worst, and provide for it. I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know of no way of judging the future but by the past. And judging by the past, I wish to know what there has been in the conduct of the British ministry for the last 10 years to justify these hopes with which gentlemen are pleased to solace themselves and this House. Is it that insidious smile, sir, with which our petition has been lately received? Trust it not, sir. It will prove a snare unto your feet. Suffer not yourselves to be betrayed with a kiss. Ask yourselves how this gracious reception of our petition comports with these warlike preparations that cover our waters and darken our lands. Are fleets and armies necessary for our work of love and reconciliation? Have we shown ourselves so unwilling to be reconciled that force must now be called in to win back our love? Let us not deceive ourselves. These are the implements of war and subjugation, the last argument to which kings resort. And I ask, gentlemen, sir, what means this martial array if its purpose be not to force us into submission? Can gentlemen assign any other possible motive for it? Has Great Britain any enemy in this quarter of the world to call for all this accumulation of armies and navies? Oh, come now. No, sir, she has none. They are meant for us. They can be meant for no other. They are sent over to bind and rivet upon us those chains with which the British ministry has been so long forging. And what have we to oppose them? Shall we try argument? Sir, we have been trying that for the last 10 years. Have we anything new to offer upon the subject? Nothing. We have held the subject up in every light of which it is capable, but it has all been in vain. Shall we resort to entreaty and humble supplication? What terms shall we find that have not already been exhausted? Let us not, I beseech you, sirs, deceive ourselves any longer. We have done everything that can be done to avert the storm which is now coming on. We have petitioned, we have remonstrated, we have supplicated, we have prostrated ourselves before the throne and implored its interposition to arrest the tyrannical hands of the ministry and parliament. Our petitions have been slighted. Our remonstrances have produced additional violence and insult. Our supplications have been disregarded, and we have been spurned with contempt from the foot of the throne. In vain, after all these things, may we indulge in the fond hope of peace and reconciliation. It is in vain to expect relief from a king who's become a tyrant, a fool, a puppet, treason, Mr. Henry, and no longer any hope be vested in the British people. There are no Britons, no Scotsmen, no Englishmen. Only a set of wretches, sunk in luxury, who've lost their natural courage and cannot look the brave Americans in the face. Gentlemen, there is no longer any ground for hope. If we wish to be free, if we wish to preserve inviolate those inestimable privileges which belong to us as free men, Aye. If we mean not basely to abandon the noble struggle in which we have been so long engaged, in which we have pledged ourselves never to abandon, until the glorious object of our struggle be obtained, then we must fight. I repeat it, sir. We must fight! And appeal to arms and to the God of hosts is all we have left us.
Arms, Mr. Henry! What arms? We are weak, sir!
They tell us, sir, that we are weak, unable to cope with so powerful an adversary. But when shall we be stronger? Will it be the next week? Or the next year? Will it be when we are totally disarmed and a British Guard shall be stationed in every house? Shall we acquire the means of effectual resistance by lying supinely on our backs, hugging the delusive phantom of hope until our enemy hath bound us hand and foot? Sir, we are not weak if we make a proper use of those means the God of nature hath placed in our power. 3 millions of people, armed in the holy cause of liberty, and in such a country that which we possess, are invincible by any force our enemy can send against us. Besides, sir, we shall not fight our battles alone. There is a just God who presides over the destinies of nations, who will raise up friends to fight our battles for us. The battle, sir, is not to the strong alone. It is to the vigilant, the active, the brave. Besides, sirs, we have no election. Should we be base enough to desire it, it is now already too late to retire from the contest. There is no retreat, but in submission and slavery. Our chains are forged, their clanking may be heard upon the plains of Boston. The war is inevitable, and let it come. I repeat it, sir, let it come!
Mr. Henry, we speak for peace, sir!
It is in vain to extenuate the matter. Gentlemen may cry, peace, peace, but there is no peace. The war is actually begun. The next gale that blows from the north shall bring to our ears the clash of resounding arms. Our brethren are already in the field. Why stand we here idle? What is it that they wish? What would they have? Is life so dear? Or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God! I know not what course others may take. But as for me, give me liberty or give me death!
Two arms, Mr. Henry!
Nelson, the gentleman from York County.
I move that the question be put to the military resolutions proposed by Mr. Henry.
Second, Mr. President.
The question has been called and seconded on the adoption of the resolutions from the gentleman of Hanover for calling for the arming of the colony. The chair desires that every delegate weigh your decision carefully. All those in favor will say aye.
Aye!
Those opposed, no.
No!
The ayes have it. The resolutions are adopted. Mr. Henry is hereby named chairman of the said committee and is charged with preparing and proposing a plan for the organizing of this militia. I hereby declare this convention to be adjourned until 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.
Patrick Henry's speech we think of as sweeping the convention before it, and Patrick Henry made a speech, Declaration of Independence was adopted, the war is over. It was not so easy.
Henry Lee introduced a resolution by Pendleton to the Second Continental Congress. It pressed for independence from England. Thomas Jefferson was then directed by the Continental Congress to craft Lee's resolution into a national declaration of independence. As Commander-in-Chief, George Washington led American forces to victory in the Revolution. Patrick Henry became the first elected governor of a free and independent Virginia. He served 3 consecutive terms, and almost a decade later served 2 more. Word of Patrick Henry's speech spread throughout the colonies. The phrase "liberty or death" became a rallying cry for many Americans, even those who did not benefit from the Revolution.
The enslaved population heard it also, and later when Gabriel Prosser rebelled against slavery just outside of Richmond, one of the men that was captured referenced Patrick Henry, and he inverted the phrase and said death or liberty. One of the consequences was everyone began to think about freedom for themselves in a different kind of way. Women, enslaved people, and Native Americans too believed that this was the time that everyone needed to really push ahead and fight for their rights to be equal in this new society.
Their rhetoric put into emotion events they could not have suspected. The African American Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Rights Movement, and many of these movements use the rhetoric, all men are created equal. The Founding Fathers put into motion something that really in many ways spun out of anything they had ever dreamed of.
Patrick Henry is a man who is a great mobilizer in Virginia, and without Virginia there is no American Revolution. Patrick Henry's activities on the Virginia stage has national implications and will culminate in American independence and the successful waging of the war for that independence.
I think Patrick Henry should be remembered as a courageous man who would stand up when he first started speaking defiance of the king in uncompromising tones. He was a great role model for politicians in his reaching to the people, feeling their pulse.
Thomas Jefferson and others agreed that he understood the people better than anybody else. He shared the same fears and hopes. And he put people's own thoughts into persuasive, powerful words for them. That is another legacy of Patrick Henry, bringing in the rest of the people into the political process, speaking to them, speaking for them. That's democracy.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.